Okay, thank you, Elaine. It's great to be back here in St. Petersburg. I didn't really know how to prepare for this talk, and last week Oleg sent the speakers an email laying out what the themes of the meeting were, and I tend to take things rather literally. So part of the email said we were interested in developing STS in St. Petersburg, and part of it said how might STS shed some light on possibilities for the new Skolkovo Institute. And I find myself sitting at home thinking about that. So that's what I'm going to talk about, for better or for worse.
You just
Right. So I've got some minimal PowerPoints. They're just sentences that summarize what I'm going to try to say. So I wanted to talk a bit, very briefly in general, about STS and then specialize the talk. The first point that I thought it was important to stress is that STS is its own field. It's not a servant of any other field. We don't exist to help out scientists and technologies. STS is a descendant of the field that used to be called history and philosophy of science. And you wouldn't ask historians why they're doing their job. They're just historians and philosophers. So we have our own agenda too. To be very brief, I would say that the focus of STS as a field is to understand science and engineering as practice. The question is, what's it like to be a scientist or an engineer? What's it like to do scientific research? This is in contrast to the old way of thinking about science as just a body of finished knowledge. What is the work that surrounds and produces knowledge, for example, is one of the questions of STS. Having said that and insisted on the autonomy of STS, I want to say that STS is nevertheless very relevant to all sorts of concerns. I think it is a useful field of study, but it's not ever going to be useful in a determinist, causal, linear fashion. You don't call in an STS expert and say, what are we going to do now? STS is useful in the sense of illuminating, shedding important light on difficult real-world problems. And I'm going to talk a bit about how this goes. The most obvious use for STS is that most people out there in the world know almost nothing about the technical side of science and technology. So they have to think about machines and scientific theories as given things, as if they appear from outer space. But STS can help people here to understand science and technology as real situated historical products, as made by real people in specific situations. So STS helps to make possible public, critical and constructive engagement with science and technology. It brings these activities down to earth. This is very important, but I think perhaps it's not so relevant to our discussions today. So we can think about a different angle. My own work has focused for a long time on trying to understand science as culture and practice, trying to understand the hard work of producing new knowledge or making new machines. Innovation is the key word these days for what I've been studying for a long time. And I think these kind of studies, my kind of work, can feed back into scientific practice, can feed back into scientific practice in interesting and important ways. How does that go? Well, when Oleg sent us his email last week, he also sent us some PowerPoints laying out a vision of what the Skolkovo Institute will be. And I was struck by several references in these PowerPoints to the Skolkovo Institute as an ecosystem. And the word ecosystem was accompanied by images of people putting pieces of a jigsaw together. I don't know where this PowerPoint came from. Is it yours that you sent it?
You'll see it later today.
Okay, right. So we're in a kind of time warp. I'm talking about something you'll...
No, it's in Skolkovo Foundation people who sent it to me. It's Oleg and Artem are the authors, and one of them will comment upon it, I hope.
All right, so one concern at Skolkovo is to produce an ecosystem, of different sciences, different organizations that will translate the products of science and engineering into the market and commercialize them. And the image was putting jigsaw pieces together. Interdisciplinarity is another currently popular word for this idea of putting different disciplines and fields together, though we might think about inter-institutionality or inter-organizationality, something that goes beyond academic disciplines. So what do we know about this process of putting the jigsaw pieces together from STS? Most strikingly, what we know is that attempts to foster innovation through interdisciplinarity often don't work. They fail. The jigsaw pieces don't join up to one another. It's really hard to establish a real research ecosystem. Just to give you one example, a student of mine in Exeter, Jean Harrington, just finished a PhD on current attempts in Britain to translate stem cell research on animals to the clinical treatment of people with heart problems. And translation from bench to bedside is the way they put it. This is an incredibly heavily funded project in Britain. Millions and millions of pounds have been sunk into it, and very little has ever come out of it. Why? This is what Jean ended up asking herself. And the answer is that the lab researchers on one side and the doctors on the other side have got their own cultures and research agendas. And these keep them apart. They have different career structures, different publishing criteria, grant application procedures are evaluated differently for the two groups, so that their trajectories just don't fit together. The pieces don't match. They don't lead into one another. And this is the typical situation in trying to create interdisciplinary ecosystems. And I think one function of STS is simply to point this difficulty out empirically and to analyze what's going on. Interdisciplinarity, etc., is fine as an idea, but it's really very difficult to make it work. And the people who design institutes like Skolkovo, for example, need to think very hard about this problem. They need to think much harder than British funding agencies have thought about it, for example. I can come back to that later on. But I can go a bit further here. Fortunately, I once did a study, wrote a very long paper about the so-called second industrial revolution of the second half of the 19th century, a process sometimes called the wedding of science and industry. Especially, I studied the relation between academic organic chemistry in the universities and the dye industry in Western Europe. This coming together of academic science and industry was historically enormously important, and it was a very successful example of interdisciplinary or inter-institutional integration. That process in the second half of the 19th century is what led us up to places like MIT and Skolkovo today. The key point that I want to emphasize about this successful establishment of an academic industrial ecosystem was that all of the elements that came together, the jigsaw pieces that fitted together, were themselves radically transformed in this coming together. It wasn't that existing pieces magically fitted into one another, but all of the elements were tuned, mangled, as I would say, to align them with one another. Chemistry in this process became something new. At a very technical level, Kekulé's benzene ring theory, if you know about this, was part of the key. This development in theoretical chemistry was absolutely central to the joining together of academic research and industrial production. Industry was itself transformed, so were the universities, new ways of teaching, new career structures appeared, and even the law itself was changed. The German patent law had to be rewritten to make this junction of scientific research and industrial production work. So we could say that it was necessary for all of the institutions and bodies of knowledge and practice that came together in the second industrial revolution, it was necessary for them to be tuned, adapted, and mangled in relation to one another. And I also did a study of the development of science and technology in World War II, where exactly the same kind of thing can be said. There's the citation to my paper. And there's the citation to the World War II paper. What does this show us? It shows us that interdisciplinary innovation depends upon adaptive changes in the culture and practice of the groups and institutions that come together. And that kind of reciprocal adaptation is just what didn't happen in the example of British stem cell research that I mentioned. Is there any recipe for making these adaptations happen? No, there isn't. There is no algorithm for doing it. The last 150 years of history in the West has been one of experimentation with ways of trying to foster these transformations. And often these experiments fail. There's no magic formula. In America, MIT has been at the very heart of this process and pretty successful with it. I once wrote a paper in which I talked about a kind of double panopticon centered on MIT. The panopticon tried to create institutional ways of making the interior of MIT visible from outside, and at the same time trying to make the potential users of academic research visible from inside MIT, a kind of reciprocal process of visualization. So the key point here is that adaptation is the key issue. Not just trying to put things together, but thinking about how they're going to adapt and change in relation to one another. To carry on with this just a bit further, I want to say that STS knows about interdisciplinarity and inter-institutional processes. We've studied those kinds of things. But the ambition might also be not just to know about these kinds of processes, but to take part in them. Maybe that's another way in which STS can be useful. And without being possibly too immodest, I want to talk about my own recent experience in this regard. I do find myself becoming a part of these kinds of things. For example, 2 weeks ago I was at the workshop in Copenhagen, which was trying to bring together Danish roboticists and architects together in a collaboration. A couple of weeks before that, I gave a keynote talk at a conference on the history of media art. This summer, I was at a meeting that aimed to bring Chinese medicine and systems theory together. In a couple of weeks' time, I'm going to be at a meeting on the anthropology of material culture, and then I'm going to give a talk on environmental sustainability. Then I've just been invited to a management conference in Paris. And I was even invited to chair a session at an IT conference in India on biological computing. This isn't really supposed to be reading you part of my CV. Yeah. The question is, what's going on here? Why should I get invited to all these weird things, which I never used to get invited to? Yeah, I suppose it's just becoming famous, getting old, isn't it? Right. But I thought maybe it was because I recently published my book on the history of cybernetics in Britain, in which I argued that cybernetics was a science of performative adaptation And I showed how cybernetic approaches in all sorts of fields hung together with one another in what I called an antidisciplinary formation, antidisciplinary being something beyond interdisciplinary. It seems to me that a new kind of inter- or anti-disciplinary paradigm is emerging across many, many fields and institutions. And it's a paradigm that thematizes questions precisely of performance and adaptation rather than the production of knowledge for its own sake. And I think the reason why all these people in very different fields invite me along is that participants in this new paradigm want to know how to think directly about their own work and about how to relate to others. And that's where my kind of expertise fits in. Well, I've just got this much to read. Can I do that, Uli? So I think this kind of positive, constructive, integrating function might be a significant future role for STS, and it might be important now in thinking about how to design the Skolkovo Institute. The key question is how to make institutions like that adaptive at all levels, running from the ground level of the science itself up to all the organizational levels that attempt to connect research to the market. What would adaptive structures for management and entrepreneurship look like? That, I think, is the key question. And one thought that strikes me at this point is that it might even be appropriate to design a real adaptive architecture for the whole institute, one that could change and adapt to whatever the institute turns into, which is not known in advance, instead of trying to imagine some fixed structure which is literally going to be set in stone. And that's all I had to say. For me, the key message from STS is that if you want to think about innovation in terms of interdisciplinarity, the key issue to focus on is adaptation and adaptability. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Well, before we move to general discussion, one brief follow-up question to ending. Some of us who are in sociology have been to University of Bielefeld, which is supposed to be a famous factory of the brains in its architectural design, meaning these guys don't have stable walls. And every semester they can move the walls to reconfigure the students and the classes. Are you proposing something this traditional or something more ambitious in your architecture thesis?
Well, I didn't realize they could reconfigure that place. I always liked the University of Bielefeld, but
it's movable.
Yeah, I mean, you know, when I gave my talk on the history of cybernetics here last year, I talked about something a bit more ambitious, which was a building called the Fun Palace that was designed in London in the early 1960s but never built. Indeed, the Fun Palace was supposed to reconfigure itself to go along with whatever uses people found for it from day to day. But the building was also designed to be unpredictable. It was designed to sometimes change in unexpected ways that would suggest to the occupants new things to do. So it was supposed to conjure up new kinds of activities and new kinds of selves.
I just want to throw something on Bielefeld because I happened to have a chance yesterday with all the social science researchers, well, a good bunch of them in Germany from Bielefeld discussing their future research plans. It seems that place, they've run out of space. They have to actually build a new building now for their new cluster. And that was one of the issues actually that came up. Would this Bielefeld model work if you had this new building? They were making arguments. It's only 10 yards away, so they'll still be able to get there. But it's interesting. I mean, the researchers themselves are debating the architecture.
Yeah, very good.
You can leave it there. We'll use the same. Well, so we have the recommendation for the mini-mog of STS and the Fun Palace of STS. What about becoming more serious? So who would like to join? Yeah, Michelle, please. Okay, Michelle Lamont, Harvard.
So I just want to ask Andy, what is performative adaptation?
Well, it's precisely adaptation at the level of performance. Right? So it's what happens in biological evolution. Species learn how to get on with their environments, and the environments evolve and get along with the... So it's adaptation at that level. It's not purely adaptation at the level of thinking. It's adaptation at the level of doing.
Okay, Trevor has to add something.
Yeah, I'm struck. I think the metaphor of experimentation is the right metaphor if I had to do this. But I'm struck how, in the case studies I've looked at, that there's another model to the sort of MIT model that people build. I mean, for instance, this synthesizer guy basically builds his own laboratory for studying sound. I just read the biography of Steve Jobs. It's a really good biography, and you discover that how Jobs sets up the key part of the whole thing with the Apple stores is he has a laboratory. He basically experiments with different designs of stores until he finds the one that he thinks is right. So it's kind of a laboratory for stores. So I think experimentation is the right metaphor as well.
Yeah,
somehow it's also these people seem to be able to set up their own laboratories, and there's a flexibility in it as well.
Performative experimentation is the key. We don't know the future. All we can do is try this and try that and see what's going to happen.
I have a question actually to both panelists so that the students understand what's going on better, because we're not only catering to the foundation but to the broader academic masses. And I already played this trick with poor Vincent, so I have to explain in 3 words what's going on. And if we had to describe the STS tribe in 1 sentence, how would you define it? Phenomenologically, that's what is being done in STS departments in US and Europe, or some other non-phenomenological way of delimiting what is STS. Of course, Andy proposed some lineage with the history and philosophy of science, but the parent does not define the child, right?
Go on, Trev.
Well, I think also you have to differentiate between the different, the teaching wing of STS, which is really important for us. Sorry, push this. Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah. Now we have a graduate program. We're well institutions. We have a graduate program and undergraduate majors in biology and society. We're doing a lot of service teaching for scientists and engineers. And I teach this big class called What is Science? For 120 students every year, capture that. So we have to think about what in the teaching role. And I usually present it in one sentence. This is the students in science and engineering. They're too busy doing problem sets and being in the laboratory. This is one of the few moments in their career they get a chance to reflect upon the actual activity of science and engineering. There's no other spaces in most universities to do that. So I think the teaching mission of STS, that's how I would define it for scientists and engineers. But Annie's now going to define the research mission in 1 sentence.
I'm not actually very interested in defining STS at all. Of course, I'm teaching at the moment. It's called Cyborg Studies, and it's about what's it like to be in the material world. The question is being and becoming, and the relationship between people and things. That's what I mean by material. I think that's the most important general question you could ask. And of course, it kind of comes down to earth, talking about various sciences and machines, but it also comes down to earth in questions like Foucault's technologies of the self. I could have followed Trevor's talk on the cybernetic 60s. I don't think there's any reason to be too limited in this kind of work myself.
Well, if defining limits you, Andy, please don't do it. But there's Steve who wanted to join. Finally, we produced enough emotion in him to wish to move in.
Oh, he's working out.
No, you press it on. Yeah, it's working.
I'm with Andy on this. I think it's not productive to try and define science and technical studies. I think it's probably a bad idea to try to limit it. What interests me about science and technology studies is it's very difficult to define. It's a multidiscipline which is constantly at war with itself. So it's disagreeing, and I think that's very productive. And it keeps changing very much indeed. We had a conference in Oxford a few years back does STS mean business? I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Where one of the participants said, you know, before we can say whether STS has an effect on business and technology, we must understand what STS is. We must define it before we can sell it. And I made the point here that nowhere in the history of industry, anywhere on this earth, have people defined their product before they're able to sell it. So I think it's a misapprehension to be quite so, worry too much about getting straight exactly what it is, what's in and what's out.
Yeah, I agree with that absolutely in terms of definition. But one can say more about what sorts of things is STS particularly good at when you're comparing with other disciplines. So I just mentioned I edited this new handbook of sound studies. So in writing that introduction, I had to think about, we had something I did with Karen Beckersveld, Lectorium of Sound from Maastricht University in the Netherlands. We had to think about what particular advantage does STS offer in a field where there are already competing definitions of sound studies out there. And for us, it was the materiality of sound that STS is particularly good at dealing with. So, you know, there's a word, materiality, you can throw that in, you can start to cash out what that means with particular examples of the material production of sound, the attendance to the details of how particular sounds are produced from bits of technology. You often get into technology when you start talking about materiality. So I think you can start to say what we're particularly good at, what comparative angle SDS has in compared to other disciplines for addressing certain sorts of topics.
Okay, well, having listened to our peers and colleagues from UK and US, I see that there was a Russian wish to comment. I wonder whether Victor would prepare at a certain point, but I see Mikhail who would like to interject.
I have a question which I believe is asked every time when there is an administrative knowledge. It seems that from what we know from the conventional technology history that there are periods of great innovativeness of performative adaptability and less. We just believe that the Renaissance or even in the period of industrial revolution was the most innovative period. And say ancient Egypt was not very much. And any administrator would ask you why, firstly, if it is really so, well, that is a way of rewriting history. And secondly, if there are periods of great innovativeness and less innovativeness, what's the limiting factor? How we can stimulate this kind of great adaptability? What's behind that? Is it religious values, demography, whatever?
Would you like to answer that? Wouldn't you like to answer this question?
Well, I think it's. I haven't studied whole eras, right? It's a great question to think about. What historical eras, what particular places are really important. I mean, one of the best research topics, I guess, in this whole area of innovations is I understand that you're trying to emulate Silicon Valley and this greenfield site outside of Moscow. But if you read Christopher Lecoy's history of Silicon Valley, one of the things one reads from that book is the importance of established defense industries being there. So it's a long history. So Steve Jobs, for instance, you read this book, his life doesn't come from anywhere. One of his early interactions with Hewlett-Packard, an earlier company that had been established there. So there's a whole history of companies. They've got a research university, Stanford, that's very important for it. So defense contractors. So in particular places, it becomes a very complicated story of what leads to sort of an innovative culture in a particular place. But I think it does seem that there are certain places, and sociologists have tried to address this issue in a much more systematic way, thinking about, you know, what do you need? Do you need a university? Do you have to have a startup industries located? Which startup industries? There is, and Michel probably knows about this research on this. There is research in this area to try and think about it contemporaneously.
Yeah, I mean, what Trevor just said is right. But
Louis Powell, by the way, is doing research together. He's got a big project in comparing. It's mainly in biotech, all the different startups. It's within America. And what are the factors that make it big?
But the answer you personally believe is this is path dependency and non-history of interactions and how we can know the culture. That kind of activity.
I mean, there's also a big element of charts. So, you know, when I was... The important thing about this development in the second half of the 19th century was the first one to kind of glue together academic research and industry. Depended, apart from anything else, on finding a fabulous collection of material substances. These molecules, if we want to think about it in terms of molecules, just happen to be great things for spinning out a certain kind of scientific theory, and they were great things for dyeing cloth. They were very important. That's why they were important. And it just happened that the way the theory developed and the industry developed fitted together, right? Nobody, without the... Thomas Pynchon has got a great quote about this. We have to look into the heart of certain molecules to think of it. And without those molecules, nothing would have happened. But given that they were there, it becomes very interesting to look at the way directors of academic chemical labs actually moved into industry and spent 20 years developing. You could synthesize a dye like indigo in the laboratory, but then it's an enormous amount of work to scale that up to an industrial scale. And tremendous flows of researchers between the university and industry. And flows of materials, you know, pure chemicals coming from the industry back. So there's an element of chance, but you can try and create the situation to exploit it. Shows that.
Okay. Michelle has a question, but I wonder whether Victor has to comment something. Okay, well, so first Michelle, then Victor, because, okay.
Why don't you ask Victor's question? Give it to him.
So my comment is really about the institutional settings that might favor or not the kind of cross-pollination between the industry and the market, which the industry and research that we both talked about. I'm thinking about universities such as MIT or Harvard, which are extremely driven by the need to generate money, which means that engineering schools are built on the premise that you will get talents that will then feed into the university. And I happen to be serving on a high-level committee in France, which is struggling with the puzzle that in France this is not happening at all. You know, the Haut Conseil de la Science et de la Technologie are trying to figure out how can we get French industries and French universities to collaborate more. And it is not only that there's, I think, all kinds of legal and institutional barriers to doing it, but there's also huge cultural resistance because, you know, money is viewed as corrupting and incompatible with the world of research. So in some ways I'm tempted to ask both of you, for your research, for instance, one could derive a kind of basic model from the mold case that you gave us, you know, I mean, in terms of steps that Mr. Mold followed, you know, it's a path-dependent process that is not entirely idiosyncratic, right? I mean, the question of feedback effect from the users, the question of marketability, and I'm wondering whether one could really think about, you know, abstracting the model and, you know, seeing if there's any correspondence to the second revolution that, so now to be critical of STS, I would say that one of the weaknesses, if you think about it in tension with sociology, is the issue of generalizability. Not in terms of law, but in terms of thinking about how are processes transposable from case to case. So to the extent that STS defines its identity as an intellectual process, as an intellectual project, in part in tension with social science disciplines such as sociology, I'm asking you whether we could think about the next step as really trying to think comparatively between such case studies, and not only in terms of the kind of scholarly literature, the scholarship that you've done, but also in terms of understanding better the social processes that would help the French face, you know, for them it's a drama. I mean, this is like the decline of, you know, whatever French engineering in relation to American engineering. That's what they are applying it to. And on this committee, I don't have the only social scientists. More than half of the committee is private industry representative. And for some reason, they don't think that it's relevant to have social scientists there, which really makes me wonder about the social impact of STS. I mean, I think it's wonderful that in the context of the project that Oleg is, that you're now exploring here this weekend, STS is thought to be useful. But in some ways, I mean, is it that useful if there is a reluctance to think about social processes?
Well, I have nothing against thinking about.
These are funny microphones. Everybody else sees it's on, not you.
To defend STS at the moment, what it does, it develops concepts. So one of the concepts in my research, you'll see the role of users. You'll see another concept. When I thought about sellers, I said they're mediators. And these are familiar concepts. I think Bruno Latour's group would be also thinking about these terms. And you can also think in general terms, what do mediators do? Well, they move. People that move are always interested. So salespeople move. So people that are moving are interesting as well. So we have a set of concepts and heuristics, but what you're calling for, the sort of systematic comparison, hasn't not yet been done. And it'd be interesting to do that, to think about. I mean, Andy's case study is very, very different to mine. It's very clear. The sorts of technology, the period is different. And also mine is one where there's two sites. It's intriguing because there's this guy on the West Coast who's in the middle of Haight-Ashbury, in the middle of psychedelia. But he doesn't develop the technology that becomes successful. You need this 50 engineer who's isolated, but they both have big research universities near them. Buchler had been at Berkeley, Moog at Cornell. And something about the isolation of Moog actually works to his advantage. So it's really complicated, but I agree. I'm nothing against thinking about comparison and trying to generalize, but I think we're already doing some of that in STS. I hope so.
Yeah, Andy,
I'm not sure that I agree that the next step is to do comparative sociological studies. That's one way of doing sociology, but it's not my way of doing it. For me, the next step is to think about questions of ontology, what the world is like, what the world is like, which doesn't fit into the frame of classical sociology at all. You said something about social processes. Certainly, I think we all study them already. Maybe a more constructive way of saying something in response to your question is, so for me, a key concept is something like open-ended adaptation, experimental finding out what works. What I was just talking about, what Trevor's example points to, is precisely this process of open-ended adaptation between all sorts of actors. If you're thinking about real institutions and how to create them, the question is, what stops institutions being adapted? What are the social structures that get in the way? And that question used to be a kind of abstract theoretical question for me until I moved back to Britain, where I found myself working in a totally non-adaptive organisation. It's hierarchical, it's top-down, it's fixed on a set of measures to the expense of anything else. We need to perhaps look at models of really bad ways of doing things. And that PhD dissertation I just mentioned is a less emotional version of the same thing. Why don't those things, why can't the clinicians and the people experimenting on mice adapt to one another? What's getting in the way? Yes.
Thank you. Vincent?
So I also hear with Michelle's comments.
Yeah, it is. It's on.
And I think she's actually much more friendly to us than what she a current concern from people who get exposed to STS and who come out of that exposure by seeing only basically a few case studies and a few very detailed case studies, and that they don't see they don't see a statistical mode of approaching these questions. They don't see that as much as they do want, and they don't really know what to do with these it's endless. Like we could study labs after labs, and we could have the same set of concepts, but each lab would be slightly different, and we wouldn't sort of aggregate or we wouldn't capitalize on that. What I find really interesting is that we now have a few interesting studies of a different mode of reasoning than the statistical mode of reasoning. And I'm thinking of studies of the EU central bank, the German central bank, and the New Zealand central bank by a scholar who is not well known but really interesting. His name is Doug Holmes. And he's doing fieldwork with these bags, and what he discovers is that in the center of these sort of centers of calculation, central banks, what are they doing now? Just crunching numbers. Well, they actually don't do that. What they do now is they actually send teams of quasi-ethnograpers in the field to figure out what the next stage of these markets are going to be. So these guys have been doing up to the early 90s, a very basic, survey. You send surveys to heads of corporations and get back that information and then process that. And you try to figure out what to do with your interest rates on that basis. And they figured that they were just not getting anything. So they actually moved something that looks like ethnography, sending people and basically spending time in these companies. And the big question is how do you consolidate that? Because you have all these teams of investigators coming back to the central bank, and so what do you do with the? And so what's interesting is they've been balancing between doing basically statistics on their clients. I mean on the people who are actually going to need money in the future and talking to them, and they realize that they actually need to have people who can talk to these companies and be like sensors, very subtle sensors of what the next, what their needs are going to be, where the markets are going to be, and they translate that into a policy implementation. And so they are still struggling to figure out how to translate that. But they are really eager to keep that first phase, which is, we just visit these guys and we don't really know what they're saying. It's like an open-ended interaction.
Okay. Well, thank you. I wanted Victor to say something. Finally, he wants to. And as a ways of introducing, I should tell you that this gentleman first brought A&T as a fashion in Russia, and then he just nailed the last nail into its coffin in the latest introduction to the book on A&T.
That's my major suit. Thank you. But that comment is going back to the comment of Steve, and also about translation. It's interesting what's going on with STS when it's trying to sell itself to the industry. And this is a really interesting case for investigation. Because that's what we have started point of view, just knowledge about. Because we can, I see strong analogy with what happened to as a methodology when they tried to sell itself to the industry. You all remember this project with Lucy Sachman, the oriented objects and Xerox company, and now Ontology, Circle, and Rolls and Gary made something like that with the medical industry in the States, trying to explain how ethnography helps to understand why healthcare service in the States so bad. The hands in our health. Yes. So what's interesting that all those type of ethnographical approaches use the same type of video when they try to explain why industry needs them. It's a strong opposition between language and speech, between formal rationality and practical rationality. We all start with saying, okay guys, you know how things are supposed to be done. You know how things are supposed to be organized. You know how markets are supposed to work. You know how law is supposed to work. And now we ethnographers come and say what's really going on there. Because that is a language, and we all know that language does not exist. And this is a speech, and this kind of quasi-Livingstonian move always helps to sell ourselves to the industry people. Because hating this money for research, I would start saying like, okay guys, here's what is supposed to be done, you know it for sure, and let's look what's going on really. What's interesting that STS looks like something that helped present that kind of stupid opposition between speech and language. It looks like something that helps to go beyond the stupid, a little bit ideological statement that there is something like formal rationality and things are supposed to be organized like that, and now we, ethnographers, will show you the truth. But I still don't understand how it can happen. But yes, thank you.
Sounds like Steve has an answer.
I'm horrified by this version of ethnography that you give us. It seems to me that good ethnography is not about telling you what really goes on, or how it actually is. And I was always horrified that in laboratory life it was rather showing what really went on in science. Good ethnography is posing questions, being skeptical, raising queries. It's producing curiosity with the people that you're talking with. It's absolutely not trying to supplement one form of real description for another form of real description. And coming back to the earlier comments, it seems to me that if you take that seriously as a potentially very productive kind of dialogue with a whole series of people, business, academics and so on, you don't want to be talking about generalising. I mean, we've known this sort of quasi-historical sensibilities on this. It seems to be that when social science tries to generalise, you get into talking about using concepts exactly about social processes and social institutions. Guess what? They don't work when you try them out on people. When you talk to potential clients or potential new audiences for the kind of work we do, and you talk about social processes and social institutions, the eyes glaze over very quickly. You have to find a register for talking to these people where you pique their curiosity, where it's a conversation about questions rather than just answers.
Okay, well, Michelle wanted to say something.
Well, it's very funny. I feel when words like generalization are used, they're like little bombs because it ignites people's epistemological commitments to like positivism, and these are major dividers. I think I could have said the same thing by simply saying, let's think about what both case studies are cases of and what are the similarities and differences. That's really what I'm talking about. It's not at all a kind of Pickering view of producing law-like statement, which I take to belong to the prehistory of the social sciences. It's really, I think, when we're talking about looking at social processes and ontologies, we're looking actually at the same thing. For me, whether you're tying this to sociology as a disciplining process, intellectually or not, is really much less interesting than thinking about how can this endeavor, whatever you call it, to me, whether it gets the label STS or not is fairly irrelevant. Whether we're talking about a series of discrete studies that are juxtaposed to each other, and then what you end up having, it's like, say, 3-day meeting of STS is really performances that are juxtaposed without any sense that we're gaining any kind of understanding from case to case of, are they just juxtaposed to each other? In some ways, I want to know the mode case. I mean, how does it compare to other processes of diffusion of knowledge or diffusion of technology? Is this one totally idiosyncratic in what ways is it similar or different?
Okay, well, we can take it as a comment if nobody wants to respond. And actually, I wanted to say the following. Олег Алексеев, вы не хотите сказать пару слов или задать вопрос? У нас есть в этой секции еще 10 минут. Или я перейду к каким-нибудь комментариям.
Thank you for this opportunity, but it's my first meeting with STS, and I'm ready to ask you. Maybe after the presentation, spoke and I asked Artyom to develop on the case of our negotiations about the agreement with MIT and what kind of limitations understand. Maybe how it was following. It's a good example to discuss in group of Skolkova and other basis of it, so we can develop the STS after the Skolkova.
Okay, thank you. Well, then, given the fact that we'll have a special section on business and a special section on Russia and Skolkovo, I wanted to stress the academic side of it. And the academic side, which was so far stressed by Trevor, I think, very well, was the following very simple situation. There are lots of engineering schools which teach engineering. And what Trevor stressed is that engineers are not taught how they do engineering themselves. And that's what STS does. It teaches engineers about themselves. How do they live? And what do they do as engineers? That was the first thing, which of course is very important and serious. Now, I had a president of the future Skolkovo Institute of Technology in my office yesterday morning. He is an aeronautics and aerospace engineer from MIT, Edward Crowley. He came and he basically said that he doesn't know the way Oleg Alexeyev formulates it, but for me he said it's always important that physicists and chemists understand something about policy issues, meaning he more or less kind of recast your suggestion to government talk, because he knows that MIT has to sell it to the government very often, so you have to have engineers who can be at least active spokespeople in saying that kind of chemistry we need or that kind of physics we should be investing to. So that's the second thing why it's important. But I think if we formulate on these two roles, we lack the wonder, or we miss the wonder of what drives Andy. And this is the wonder at the complexity of the world, because what I think what STS does to engineers is one thing, but what it does to social scientists, it's like when you're aged not 25 but 35 or 45 and you realize you still don't know anything about the physics of the universe. And you've got some years to finally to fill the gap and live something which is not just pure sociology, but something which is a monumental claim that you're closer to Greek philosophers who knew something both about the world and the human beings. That's when STS becomes of epochal promise. And I think that we shouldn't be under-stressing. It's basically, it has an impact not only on engineers and the way engineers understand themselves. It's about how we understand ourselves as human beings. Yeah, Trevor.
Yeah, I echo that. I sort of want to say there's an area also of STS that we haven't talked about, which hasn't yet really developed. And Steve Shapin, just at the recent Society for Social Studies Science meeting, joint meeting with HSS and Cleveland, said this, is that, and I agree with him, we don't actually, because we avoid psychology, we don't talk very much about the actual process of invention in terms of individual actors, how they come up with these ideas, this sense of wonderment that perhaps Andy has with the mystery of the world. And it's a sort of an area we don't like to go into very much, because I think historically we've avoided thinking about it in terms of psychology. But I think it's an interesting area that I myself have written one paper which I've been trying to think about. What is it that Mo brings? How can he be this person who can create this new technology? And how do you start to think about invention in an interesting way? So we don't want to go back to the old psychological categories. We have to think of an innovative way of doing it. But I just want to put that out. I think this is a great research topic that SDS and other scholars can start to think about.
Okay, well, thanks. Well, I think we, as professors, have monopolized the floor for quite some time. We've got 6 minutes for students. I'm ready to work as a translator if somebody wants to pose a question in Russian. So I will take the humble position of just translating your questions. Я готов перевести любой вопрос студентов, это будет по-русски на тему нынешней панели, или можно по-английски, как хотите. На тему можно встать и спросить, что такое СТС. So those people who are in the back of the room and in the back corners, any questions? Есть ли у нас вопросы?
Есть вопросы совсем про то, что сейчас значит STS.
Okay, Anna has a question, but it's not exactly the question of what is STS, it's some other question.
Да, про адаптацию, потому что Джан, например, говорит про меню,
So it's about adaptation. When we're speaking about the mini-mog or just mog,
мы видим, какую играл в Англии, я имею в виду, что правильно произошло. А когда, например, мы анализируем другие, хорошо называть инновации, там, биологии, медицины.
Just stop, подождите секундочку. So when we're analyzing this, we read Trevor's article on mini-mog, so we know about the role of the salesperson, like Van Hoveren, or whatever the name is. I forgot it. But when we translate or transfer that argument into the studies of biology, for example.
Насколько важен в этом случае как при анализе, сколько роли мы должны уделять рассмотрению именно роли людей или
sales? So when we do that, the study of biology, how much role we should pay to what humans do, in particular the salespeople of biological products?
Great question. And I just want to make a little pitch here. As the salespeople always talk about pitches. But selling in more different contexts. I've just written an article with a grad student, Asaf Dar, on the neglect in sociology of studying salespeople. So there's given the importance of selling as an industry, it's a huge number of people who work in sales, and they're very few, it's very, very understudied. Possibly because people kind of sneer at salespeople in some sense. They don't take them seriously. And so I would have thought if you're interested in biology, all these companies that produce these devices and ideas have at some point to do the selling of these devices. And you can find these people, they really exist, they're not so hard to find, and start to study them. And that's the starting point of it. I haven't studied it in biological theories, but I know so little about biology, it's out of my depth, but I certainly will find these sales forces there and hanging out with them, doing ethnography with them, interviewing them, or doing historical research on particularly important pieces of biological technology and how it was actually sold. It seems to be a really great research project.
Okay. Well, I guess Trevor has picked up on his favorite topic about the sales. By the way, Trevor, in Russian, frequently new English words get sedimented into Russian language unless they are in high demand. And in the last 10 years, there's a new Russian word called sales. No, sales meaning that's a person who goes into sales. Тут пришел один sales и предлагал мне один продукт. Okay, Anna has a question.
I think I understood how you theory you're working on historical, like chemical industry or so on, but how can you use it for explaining development institution? For example, Scotland.
It's on.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I don't know really what the problem is, right? I mean, my study of the 19th century thing was I was trying to show that institutions develop open-endedly along no particular trajectory, and sometimes they interactively stabilize one another. I was trying to generalize my image of what happens inside the lab from the micro to the macro. And the conclusion was, for me, that very big things are mangled and emergently transformed. Today I was calling that mangling, tuning and adaptation. And I was trying to extract a kind of general moral from this, that we need to pay attention to adaptation when we're designing institutions. And my later comment was actually we tend to produce anti-adaptive organizations that deliberately are structured so they can't adapt, and that's really the problem.
Okay.
Do they need some distance from our object in sociological perspective when we use mangling theory? It's maybe an epistemological question, but it's very practical in our situation. Can we use this model for searching a modern institution in development, in the process of development? Or maybe it's too complicated for practical.
Well, I mean, I think the important thing is The important aspect of the model is that we don't know the world. We're surrounded by extremely complex systems. We can't predict how they're going to behave, and we have to build that into our way of going on in the world. So instead of having social theories that freeze organizational structure, we need to develop ways that are essentially experimental and performative, trying to find out. And that's a very concrete instruction, and you can find real examples of what's it like to try and build an adaptive organization. One of the people I studied, Stafford Beer, was the world expert on the cybernetics of management. His whole concern was how can you make adaptation the center of an organization rather than something that happens in the margin. I don't know if I'm talking about what you're asking me, but I mean, that's the line of thought. Yeah.